My name is Kendra Lawson, and for 11 months, the back seat of my Honda Civic was the only bedroom I had. It wasn't because I lacked money. I had a solid job, plenty of savings for deposits, and pristine paperwork. Yet, for 5 long years, my stepmother made it her personal mission to destroy every single apartment lease I ever tried to sign. She would relentlessly track down property managers and feed them the exact same venomous script, painting me as a deeply untrustworthy liability who would steal their belongings or vanish without paying. I would get to the final step of moving in, only to have the door slammed in my face. While I slept in freezing temperatures, my father sent me exactly one text message. Beg for forgiveness, and we'll let you return. I never replied. I knew it wasn't an invitation to come home. It was a demand for my absolute surrender. Then, everything changed on a dreary afternoon outside a cheap laundromat. An elegant older woman in a tailored suit approached me. She handed me a thick, sealed envelope and introduced herself as a lawyer, representing a man I hadn't seen in over a decade. Looking me dead in the eye, she said, "My client hired me 12 years ago, specifically for this exact day. If you've ever had someone in your own family turn your name into a warning label, stay with me. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe only if you truly want to hear how people survive them." Before the parking lots and laundromats, I grew up behind a stone gate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The estate was sprawling, immaculate, and utterly devoid of warmth. Every room was curated for appearance rather than comfort. My father, Howard Lawson, was the driving force behind this obsession with image. As the head of the Lawson Residential Group, he spent his days developing luxury homes and upscale apartment complexes. He built beautiful sanctuaries for the wealthy elite, yet his own house felt more like a sterile corporate showroom. When Marlene Drake married my father, she seamlessly slipped into this rigid environment. On the surface, she was the epitome of a perfect society wife. She was unfailingly polite, knew how to charm high-net-worth donors, and always maintained a flawless, camera-ready smile. Publicly, she even served as the face of the Lawson Housing Initiative, a charity dedicated to providing safe and affordable living situations for young women in crisis. The hypocrisy was suffocating. The very woman who stood on podiums preaching about the fundamental right to a secure home was the exact same person orchestrating my displacement behind closed doors. She possessed a terrifying ability to weaponize her charitable persona. Marlene didn't just bring her wardrobe into our household. She brought her son from a previous marriage, Colin Drake. Almost immediately, Colin was absorbed into the Lawson residential empire. My father practically rolled out the red carpet for his new stepson. Colin was handed a corner office with a panoramic view, invited to sit in on executive board meetings, and aggressively introduced to investors as the future of the company. I watched from the sidelines as my father mentored Colin with a level of patience and enthusiasm he had never directed toward me. Any attempt I made to participate in the family business was swiftly brushed aside, treated as an annoying interruption rather than a genuine display of ambition. My alienation worsened when I started asking questions about the financial arrangements left by my maternal grandfather, Russell Vance. Russell was a pragmatic man who never believed in vague verbal promises. He trusted ironclad paperwork. Knowing the complicated dynamics of my household, he had wisely established a substantial trust fund specifically in my name. Its sole purpose was to ensure I would always have reliable housing, the means to continue my higher education, and financial independence from Howard. My grandfather wanted me protected. However, my father legally controlled the distribution of those assets. Whenever I politely requested access to the funds to secure a place of my own, Howard would dismiss me with a cold stare. He would cross his arms and declare that the trust would be handled when I learned to behave more maturely. That was the exact opening Marlene needed. She expertly reinforced my father's baseless justifications, subtly shifting the narrative to paint me as the core problem. During formal dinners or conversations with relatives, she began dropping calculated adjectives to describe my character. She would sigh heavily, look at me with feigned pity, and call me unstable. She would shake her head, labeling me ungrateful. If I showed the slightest hint of frustration, she immediately deemed me not ready for any real responsibility. I was slowly being written out of my own life, categorized as a troubled burden, while they solidified their absolute control over my future. The first lease fell apart the week I was supposed to pick up the keys. It was a small, modest studio across town, nothing spectacular, but it was mine. I had successfully passed the initial background check, submitted my employment verification, and had the security deposit sitting securely in my checking account. I was practically packing my bags when the property manager called. His tone on the phone was incredibly awkward and hesitant. He cleared his throat several times before vaguely mentioning a sudden concern from a family reference. I stood frozen in the middle of the sidewalk, completely bewildered. I had explicitly avoided listing anyone from Greenwich on my application forms. There was absolutely no reason for my stepmother to be involved, yet her invisible hand had somehow reached into my private affairs. I brushed it off as a bizarre administrative fluke and tried again. A month later, another promising apartment application was abruptly canceled during the final verification step. The leasing agent suddenly stopped returning my calls and simply mailed my check back without a single word of explanation. By the third attempt, the rejection was brutally direct. An independent landlord, an older man who managed a quiet duplex, looked me straight in the eye and stated he couldn't rent to me. He admitted that someone had anonymously warned him I had a troubling history of taking valuable items and money from my previous residence. The pattern became undeniably clear. Every single time I was inches away from securing a safe place to sleep, Marlene found a way to intervene. She didn't need to scream, hire expensive private investigators, or file frivolous lawsuits. All she had to do was make one polite phone call or send a brief, elegantly worded email to the right leasing office. She specialized in planting just enough plausible doubt into the minds of property managers who already hated dealing with risky tenants. Once I realized the true scope of her sabotage, I stopped reacting with shock and started operating with cold precision. I began obsessively keeping every single piece of documentation. I hoarded printed rejection emails, backed up bizarre voicemails from landlords, cataloged every refunded deposit slip, and took detailed screenshots of my pristine financial records. If she was building a false narrative, I was quietly building an impenetrable archive of the truth. While my file of evidence grew thicker, my physical reality grew much harsher. I maintained a grueling schedule working the evening shift at a local logistics company, completely hiding my desperate situation from my coworkers. When my shift finally ended, I would drive directly to a 24-hour gym just to take a hot shower and wash my uniform in the sink. I spent my mornings sitting in the public library, charging my phone, and tirelessly applying for new rentals on their computers. At night, I navigated the city seeking out well-lit, secure parking lots where I could recline my driver's seat and sleep without the constant fear of a window being smashed. During those exhausting months, my best friend, Tessa Morales, was my only lifeline. On the most brutally cold mornings, she would let me into her apartment so I could sit in her warm kitchen and drink a cup of hot coffee before facing the day. Tessa constantly begged me to just move into her spare room. She offered her couch, her floor, anything to get me out of the freezing temperatures. But I stubbornly refused. I knew exactly how vindictive my family could be, and I was terrified Marlene would somehow drag Tessa's name into this toxic mess. I couldn't risk ruining her life, so I kept my head down, focused purely on surviving each grueling day, and fiercely protected my evidence. The text from Dad came while I was folding my work shirts under the fluorescent lights of a laundromat. The vibration of my phone startled me. I looked at the glowing screen and read the brief message from Howard. "Beg for forgiveness, and we'll let you return." I stared at the harsh letters for a long time. There were absolutely no questions about my well-being. He didn't ask if I was safe, where I was sleeping, or if I needed food. I instantly understood the cold reality behind those words. Howard was fully aware of exactly how I was living, yet he was actively choosing to leverage my desperation to force my complete submission. I didn't type a single word in response. Instead, I took a screenshot of the demand, locked my screen, and added the image to my growing digital archive of evidence. Just as I tossed my phone back into my duffel bag, the heavy glass door of the laundromat swung open. A sudden rush of freezing wind blew inside, followed by an older woman. Dressed in a meticulously tailored professional suit, she looked entirely out of place among the rattling washing machines. She scanned the empty room, her eyes quickly locking onto me. She walked over with purposeful steps and quietly asked if I was Kendra Lawson. I tensed up, my guard rising immediately. Over the past several months, anyone who had gone out of their way to find me usually came armed with impossible conditions. I cautiously nodded. She extended a firm hand and introduced herself as Teresa Holt, a specialized estate and trust lawyer. Before I could even ask who sent her, she looked at me with profound seriousness and delivered a sentence I will never forget. "Your grandfather, Russell Vance, hired me 12 years ago for this exact day." She reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope sealed with thick wax. I looked closely at the front of the pristine parchment. Written across the center was Russell's unmistakable signature. Right beneath his name were extremely specific, handwritten instructions. The envelope was strictly only to be opened if I was ever forcibly pushed out of my home, unfairly blocked from accessing my trust fund, or if my reputation was intentionally damaged by my own family. A heavy wave of realization crashed over me as I read his handwriting. My grandfather hadn't just loved me blindly. He possessed a terrifyingly accurate understanding of human nature. He had predicted that my family would eventually try to use money and housing as weapons to absolutely control me. He had seen this exact crisis coming a decade before it happened. My fingers twitched, eager to tear the seal open and discover what he had left behind. However, Teresa gently placed her hand over mine. She calmly explained that we could not open the confidential documents in a public laundromat. She instructed me to pack my things and follow her directly to her secure office so we could formally document every single step of the process. Teresa opened the envelope in a conference room with the blinds half closed. She set up a digital recorder on the polished table to establish a formal, legally binding record of the unsealing process. Carefully slicing through the wax, she extracted a heavy stack of meticulously organized documents. Spread across the table were the original trust agreement, a personal letter from Russell, photocopies of older correspondence, and a highly specific audit trigger clause. Teresa handed me the primary summary page. I stared at the bold numbers printed near the bottom. The trust was valued at exactly $250,000. Furthermore, I was listed as the sole exclusive beneficiary. Howard was only granted extremely limited administrative rights to oversee the investments. He possessed absolutely no legal authority to withhold the funds to manipulate my personal behavior. Naturally, Marlene had zero rights regarding any aspect of the account. I quietly asked Teresa how my father had managed to freeze my access for so long if his powers were strictly administrative. She slid a formal, notarized notice across the table. It was signed directly by Howard, officially declaring me financially unreliable and citing severe possible theft concerns as the primary legal justification for retaining the assets. Teresa leaned forward, her professional demeanor shifting into something much sharper. She explained that a trustee has a legal obligation to protect the beneficiary. However, if this devastating notice was filed based on fabricated information or manipulated evidence, the deliberate freezing of the account immediately escalated from a mere family dispute to a severe breach of fiduciary duty and bad faith administration. The law simply did not allow a trustee to invent malicious lies just to punish a beneficiary. Beneath the dense legal filings was a handwritten letter from my grandfather. It was remarkably brief, pragmatic, and entirely devoid of flowery sentiment. He simply wrote that if I was currently reading this document, it meant someone had successfully weaponized my inherent desire for independence and cruelly turned it into evidence against me. He knew I would never fail on my own terms. Alongside the letter was a certified transcript of a recorded conversation between Russell and Howard, dated shortly before my grandfather's passing. In the sharp exchange, Russell directly demanded to know if Howard would ever allow Marlene to touch the trust. The official transcript clearly documented my father swearing, on the record, that he would never permit his new wife to control a single cent of my inheritance. The most crucial piece of paper, however, was buried at the very bottom. Teresa carefully unfolded a separate legal addendum securely attached to the original trust charter. My grandfather had brilliantly implemented a fail-safe mechanism. The clause explicitly stated that if the trust was ever withheld past a specific grace period without concrete, verifiable evidence of my alleged financial incompetence, a mandatory independent audit of the entire account had to be triggered immediately. Russell hadn't just left me money. He had thoughtfully left me a loaded legal weapon specifically designed to completely expose anyone who tried to steal my future. Teresa had already taken the liberty of running a preliminary surface-level review of the trust's recent administrative expenses before I arrived. She handed me a highlighted ledger, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at several recurring, highly suspicious withdrawals. The documents showed massive, inexplicable legal and consulting fees systematically bleeding the account dry. However, these fees weren't being used to manage my investments. They were being quietly funneled directly into the administrative overhead of the Lawson Housing Initiative. The horrifying realization hit me with the crushing force of a freight train. Marlene hadn't just been ruining my apartment leases to lock up my money out of petty spite. She had deliberately orchestrated my status as an unstable and financially unreliable dependent to quietly justify draining my trust fund to cover up the questionable financial gaps in her own pristine charity. By the time Teresa sent the demand letter, Marlene was already trying to control the story. The formal legal document was decisively delivered to Howard, Marlene, the acting trustees, and the corporate counsel of the Lawson Residential Group. The stipulations outlined inside were absolute. Teresa demanded the immediate unfreezing of my trust account and the prompt transfer of all its assets to an independent corporate trustee. Furthermore, she issued a strict preservation notice, legally requiring them to retain every single email, voicemail, and rental communication involving my name. They were explicitly ordered to immediately cease all contact with any prospective landlords. Finally, the letter demanded full financial reimbursement for all damages, including lost lease application fees, unfairly forfeited deposits, and the accumulated living expenses from utilizing gym facilities and storage units over the past 11 months. Instead of retreating or recognizing the severity of the situation, my stepmother launched a rapid, calculated counteroffensive. She quickly circulated an internal company email, subtly framing the impending legal action as a tragic personal misunderstanding. She claimed I was a deeply troubled, rebellious daughter, desperately trying to humiliate the family in public, simply because I had been rightfully cut off. My father, characteristically, didn't bother to call and apologize for the horrific situation. Instead, he routed a brief message through his own legal representation, requesting a quiet, private meeting back at the Greenwich house to settle things amicably. Teresa instantly advised against it. She firmly stated that we would not engage in any unrecorded conversations behind closed doors where they could easily manipulate the environment and twist the narrative to their advantage. However, the preservation notice unexpectedly triggered a chain reaction that my family hadn't anticipated. Brian Maddox, one of the property managers who had previously rejected my application, cautiously contacted Teresa's office. He confessed that he still had the original email from Marlene saved in his archives. Looking closely at the timestamps and hidden CC fields, Brian realized that the message wasn't just a one-time warning. It was actually part of a coordinated template sent to multiple properties across the area. Meanwhile, Teresa noted that Gwen Palmer, a prominent business journalist, had recently started investigating the development timelines of the Lawson residential group. Gwen was aggressively seeking verifiable records, but she was currently hitting a wall of corporate silence. The pressure on my father's company was slowly but steadily building from multiple outside angles. Despite the looming legal threats and the growing scrutiny, Marlene proceeded with her grandest annual event, the Lawson Housing Initiative Charity Gala. The heavily publicized theme for the elegant evening was, ironically, safe housing for young women. Initially, I had absolutely no desire to attend the event. I was terrified that showing up would allow Marlene to easily paint me as an unhinged, dramatic troublemaker, trying to ruin a highly respected philanthropic evening. Teresa, however, completely shifted my perspective. She calmly explained that we weren't going there to scream, cause a scene, or throw a foolish tantrum. We were attending because the entire executive board, the highest tier corporate donors, and the company's chief counsel would all be gathered in one single, inescapable room. The opulent venue was set, and the exclusive guest list was finalized. I didn't have access to my old wardrobe, nor did I want to wear anything they had ever bought me. I prepared for the evening wearing a simple, borrowed outfit that lacked any flashy designer labels. Staring at my reflection in the mirror, I realized exactly how much my mindset had shifted. I wasn't going to the gala to beg for an apology, demand my old bedroom back, or seek their elusive validation. I was going there to simply stand perfectly still and watch their faces when the undeniable, verified evidence of their actions was finally placed directly on the table. The gala was held under glass chandeliers in a room full of people who believed Marlene helped women find homes. The opulent grand ballroom of the country club was packed wall to wall with the city's most influential and wealthy figures. High-tier donors, executive board members, major real estate partners, and members of the local press mingled over crystal glasses of vintage champagne. At the front of the room, my stepmother stood gracefully at the illuminated podium. She delivered a flawlessly rehearsed, deeply emotional speech about human dignity, community safety, and the fundamental importance of offering vulnerable women second chances. Sitting proudly at the center head table was Howard. Colin sat directly beside him, positioned deliberately under the brightest spotlight to look like the natural, undisputed successor to the entire Lawson residential group empire. They painted the absolute perfect picture of a philanthropic, powerful, and deeply united family. I stood completely quietly at the very back of the expansive room with Teresa, resolutely refusing to make any disruptive noise. We didn't dramatically march down the center aisle or aggressively interrupt the flowing speeches. Instead, Teresa moved with quiet, calculated precision. She seamlessly navigated through the dense, formal crowd and handed a thick, securely sealed legal packet directly to the board's chief corporate counsel and the attending trustee representative. At that exact moment, Brian Maddox discreetly entered through the heavy side doors. He carried physical, high-resolution printouts of the original emails, complete with full digital metadata and verifiable server timestamps. The irrefutable documents unequivocally proved that Marlene had systematically contacted multiple property managers, deliberately distributing entirely false, highly damaging warnings regarding my financial reliability and personal character. Standing near the stunned executives, Brian quietly confirmed to the gathered board members that my rental application had been fully qualified and completely approved right up until the exact minute Marlene's interference occurred. The festive atmosphere around the executive table shifted from celebratory to instantly frigid. An older board member leaned across the table, his face devoid of any pleasantries, and directly asked Howard if he had explicitly known about these specific emails. My father did not answer immediately. He just stared blankly at the documents, his face turning pale. His heavy, agonizing silence became the loudest sound in the entire room, serving as the ultimate climax of the evening. Panicking, Marlene quickly stepped down from the podium and rushed over, desperately trying to whisper that this was simply a private family matter that had been unfortunately blown completely out of proportion by an angry daughter. Teresa didn't raise her voice, but her cold, measured response cut through the rising tension like a surgical scalpel, using incredibly sharp, brief legal language. She explained that when a high-ranking charity officer actively utilizes a professional corporate housing network to intentionally block a legal trust beneficiary from securing safe shelter, it entirely ceases to be a private domestic issue. It immediately becomes a documented abuse of power and a massive corporate liability for everyone involved. Standing near the back wall, Gwen Palmer watched the entire devastating exchange unfold. The experienced journalist didn't cause a noisy scene, shout disruptive questions, or shove a recorder in anyone's face. She simply observed the breakdown carefully, quietly verified the circulating facts with her inside sources, and mentally prepared the explosive investigative article that would inevitably drop once the legal filings became public record in the morning. The elite crowd hadn't even finished their main courses when the family empire began to visibly fracture. To protect the organization's rapidly deteriorating reputation, the board quietly but firmly demanded that Marlene step down from her executive role at the Lawson Housing Initiative that very night. Howard was abruptly informed by the corporate counsel that he would be temporarily suspended from his prestigious role as chairman while a comprehensive, independent financial audit was conducted on both the charity and my personal trust. Furthermore, Colin was immediately pulled from the evening schedule. He was no longer permitted to present the upcoming luxury development project, as the board realized his rapid corporate ascension was directly tied to the unethical system his mother had constructed. I didn't stay to watch the messy rest of the evening unfold. I turned around and walked out of the opulent ballroom long before the event concluded, entirely uninterested in seeing how the wealthy, judgmental crowd looked at me now. Months later, I signed a lease with my own name, my own deposit, and no family reference attached. The trust was officially transferred to an independent corporate trustee, and the arbitrary freeze was permanently lifted. I finally regained full access to my inheritance exactly as my grandfather had originally intended. The financial consequences for my family were severe, immediate, and utterly irreversible. Howard was legally forced to repay all the exorbitant legal fees he had inappropriately drained from the account, along with the wrongfully withheld distributions. Marlene was compelled to sign an ironclad settlement regarding her blatant defamation and deliberate interference with my rental opportunities. The legally binding agreement strictly banned her from ever contacting my landlords, employers, property managers, or professional donors again. The professional fallout was swift and merciless. Following the comprehensive internal audit, Marlene permanently lost her executive position at the Lawson Housing Initiative and was systematically removed from all related philanthropic boards. Howard was forced to quietly resign from his prestigious position as chair of the Lawson Residential Group. The massive corporate scandal caused the company to lose several key high-net-worth donors overnight, and a major luxury development project was indefinitely delayed pending further external review. Without his mother's manufactured influence or his stepfather's unearned protection, Colin instantly lost his expensive corner office, his guaranteed succession role, and his unearned ability to use the Lawson name as an elite social launchpad in Greenwich. Despite the total collapse of their manipulative control, nobody in that house ever offered a genuine apology. Howard sent a pathetic handwritten letter stating that he just wanted to talk as a family, completely ignoring the hell he had put me through. Marlene sent a lengthy, manipulative email explaining that she had only ever tried to protect the family from my supposed instability. I never agreed to meet Howard privately. Instead, I blocked all their phone numbers and officially informed them through Teresa that any future communication had to go directly through my legal representation. I never returned to the Greenwich house. I didn't attend any family holidays, I didn't send them updates about my life, and I never replied to Colin's frantic messages. I simply walked away and built a quiet, secure life entirely on my own terms. Looking back on those freezing nights sleeping in the back seat of my Honda Civic, I realized the most important truth I learned. When your own family actively uses basic necessities like safe housing, financial stability, and your personal reputation as weapons to completely control and humiliate you, walking away is not an act of cruelty. Cutting them off isn't a betrayal, it is simply a necessary boundary for your own survival. You are never, ever obligated to negotiate with people who actively orchestrate your destruction just to keep you obedient. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story all the way to the very end. If you have ever had to set a difficult boundary to protect your own peace and mental health, please feel free to share your thoughts, stories, or experiences in the comments below.